All right. Thank you all for joining on an early Friday morning on the third day of the IAPP Rethinking the State Summit. Special thank you to all our speakers, particularly our two online speakers who have incredibly graciously woken up very early in the morning. So many thanks. Before introducing our fantastic lineup of speakers, I want to do two things. First, I want to call out our posters in the back from the IAPP MPAs. If you have a chance after the session, please do check them out. A lot of great work went into them. And second, I want to just briefly contextualize the panel. The conceit of the panel is beyond the chainsaw. This has been used as a metaphor and a framing to articulate a new theory of efficiency, one which focuses on new austerity metrics, new efforts to either restructure public services or, in other words, to potentially dismantle public services overall. Efficiency, however, isn't necessarily a bad thing. The question is the beliefs and frameworks, values, and arguments that go into articulating what a good efficiency position is. And ultimately, in the modern age, all theories of efficiency, particularly government efficiency, are de facto theories of the role of the state and the nature of public services themselves. And our speakers today are fantastic thinkers and doers, particularly in this space. We have Mariana Mazzucato, Executive Director and founder of IAPP. We have Damon Silvers, Visiting Professor of Practice and former Policy Director and Senior Counsel at AFL-CIO. We have Rohit Chopra, former Director of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. We have Yamini Iyer, Senior Visiting Fellow at Brown at the Watson Institute, I believe, and Elizabeth Linos, Emma Bloomberg, Professor of Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School and Faculty Director of the People's Lab. And the conceit today that I want to start with is effectively two questions. The first question is a cautionary position. Within the long history of efficiency, history in the US going at least back to the 1890s with Taylorist positions going into a variety of efficiency arguments as early as 1910 into Eisenhower administration pursuing an efficiency argument, an efficiency committee, the Reagan administration doing similar, the Clinton administration doing similar. And there can be a bit of a false sense of continuity between all these arguments by virtue of not only the theory of efficiency that goes into these committees, but also the inherent idea of government that's behind them. So with that in mind, and with kind of the bold and broad history of efficiency arguments, for policymakers that are considering a chainsaw initiative, or that are considering a DOGE initiative, that are considering an efficiency-based public reform initiative, what would you like them to take seriously, or what would you like them to understand, or more specifically, what would you like them to avoid if they're earnestly trying to consider pursuing one of these initiatives? And with that in mind, I would love to call on Mariana Mazzucato first.
So we each have, is it 5 minutes?
5 to 6 minutes, yeah.
Okay, I'm actually going to time myself. I'm also going to time Damon.
There we go.
Sorry. Right, so what to be aware of. The first thing is don't even bother talking about efficiency unless you know what it's for. So the first thing is you need a theory of state capacity. Oh, sorry, of the state. What is the state for? Is it just to correct a market failure? Then you actually don't even need many capabilities or capacities. You're just there tinkering, putting bandages here and there. And the irony is you also need it actually to fix markets, because we know many markets aren't fixed. But the point is that the big question, what is the state for, needs to be answered. Keynes said it's not about just tinkering on the edges, making things a little bit better, a little bit worse, but to really be doing what's not being done at all. I actually think modern Keynesians didn't get that. They at best just think of countercyclicality. So what is it that's not being done at all? Is it just, again, a theory of a market failure? So if the private sector doesn't do something, oh, we're going to come in and fill the gap. Again, if you're just filling the gap, whether it's a financial gap or something else, what is the capacity that you need? It's very different if you're actually trying to solve really complicated problems, whether it's going to the moon and back, whether it's net zero, whether it's reducing the digital divide, whether it's allowing all your citizens to have, and not just citizens, all the people, to have health for all. That's an objective. And you need to match that objective with the kind of capabilities and capacities you need. And some of you heard our session the other day on the Public Sector Capability Index, which is a project funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies in the Institute, where we differentiate actually capacity, which is kind of like budgets, so you even have any money, routines, and then those dynamic capabilities. So even if you then get the money, have you actually invested in administrative and implementation capacity? So that's the big first warning. Like first, really have a big discussion within your government. What is the state even for? Is the public good a theory of the public good, or is it actually a theory of the private? Because the private sector is not doing something, again, public goods have to be financed. That's not a theory of the public. It's a theory of the private, and then the private doesn't do something. And again, you're filling the gap. Wow, I've got 3 minutes left. I'm timing. The second big warning is in order to work with others, right? Because it's not about the state doing everything. You do have to answer that first question. You're going to know how to work with them. And the big warning is unless you have self-worth, unless you're confident, you're going to get cheated. Or you're just going to get captured and then you're working for something else that's not the public interest. And this is why I quoted Ernest Brackett in Mission Economy. He was the head of procurement in NASA back in the 60s. He's like, uh-oh, we got to work with a lot of companies to get this done, and we won't even know how to work with them. We won't know how to write the terms of reference, the contracts, lawyers. Sorry, they're lawyers. Forgive them, they're lawyers. Oh, you're not a lawyer. I thought you were a lawyer. Oh, he's a lawyer. We won't know how to write the terms of reference if we have lost our capacity. And he saw what was happening. There was lots of outsourcing happening already back then. McKinsey, by the way, I didn't realize this, was founded in the 20s. And they already were in the door in NASA. And those of you who live here know that Theodore Agnew, a conservative Tory lord, is the one who said, use this word that then we put in our recent book, The Big Con, with my PhD student, Rosie Collington, about the big consulting companies. He said, what's going on? With Brexit and with COVID, he just saw how many consultancy contracts were being given out, like to Deloitte to do the test and trace. And Deloitte had actually no capacity or capabilities to do that. But this risk averseness within the state kind of opened that door to consulting. And he called it infantilization. So yeah, we can talk about whether DOGE is right or wrong, whether the chainsaw, but the big question is, who's even in the room? Have we trained? Have we invested in those capacities and capabilities? And this huge mega outsourcing trend that we've seen, which we call the consultification trend, what is that doing to not just the ability to do stuff like a test and trace system, but also then the confidence to negotiate, for example, the vaccine contracts. And if the health industry, the pharma industry, they're not a health industry, the pharma industry blackmails the government each time by saying, if you're going to mess about with the patents, we're leaving. If you mess about with the prices of the drugs that the taxpayer funded, we're leaving. If the government says, oh no, don't leave, okay, fine, we'll do it your way, then again, you're not working in the public interest. And that's why I often joke that I walk in as an economist and I come out as a life coach. I'm like, come on, man, have some self-worth. Anyway, I'll stop there. 30 seconds early. It says 4 minutes and 30 seconds, just because I'm sure we'll get into the weeds of some of the details I've just said.
Oh, absolutely. Second, I'd love to call on Rohit.
Well, great. Thanks for having me today. I'll start by sharing that the word efficiency is an extremely charged word. We tend to think of it as always a good, but it actually is more of a value. It's one of the things that we weigh. And in fact, this building that we sit in, it would actually be much more efficient if it had fewer pillars and fewer beams. And it would be more efficient if, it was not inspected or if it was not subject to any building codes. But actually, we value quite a bit the fact that we can walk in a building and it doesn't collapse on us. And the same could be true about the construction of airplanes, the construction of other major pieces of factories, equipment. But it's also true of how we construct our state. And in some ways, we always want to think about not just cost savings, but what is the output we are getting, not solely in dollars or pounds or euros, but also what else is it generating? Is it generating good health? Is it generating resilience? Is it generating stability? And I think that that's what we have seen over time. DOGE is really just a long-standing trend of wanting to really destroy the foundation of the state to actually advance some of those goals. Because if it is not there, those with power are able to set the rules themselves. The agency that I led had about 1,800 people. It was formed after the mortgage crash to police the financial industry to make sure that there was not going to be a repeat of that. It had a pretty, it was in the US, it's a relatively small agency, 1,800 people, but generated, even just in dollars, trillions of dollars of benefits. And every single year, it gave way more money back to consumers than it was spending. But I actually think more importantly than that, it shifted and shaped the markets in ways that generated lots of value. So I think that as we think about this term efficiency, we need to change the way that economists, and no offense to all of you, measure this, because it cannot just be in the most quantitative currency terms. It is much broader. So I think in the discussion after these openings, we should really talk about what is the path forward to how would we reconstruct in ways that are still efficient, but actually you get big bang for the buck on some of these other values that we care about so much.
Right.
Thank you so much. I would love to call on Professor Linus.
Thank you so much, and it's so great to be with all of you, at least virtually. I couldn't agree more with the previous two speakers. I guess one thing I think when we even talk about the word efficiency, for a very long time, even the economists had kind of in the back of their mind that we're talking about two sides of an equation. We're talking about what are the kinds of resources we need to invest for an outcome, exactly to the point that was just made. And so even I think in the classic definition of efficiency, the words were never just cut as much as you can. There's always this other side of like, what is the purpose or what is the outcome? My sense is that this language is really just an attempt to go back to kind of a bigger moral stance that we've heard from some factions of the US, which is that it's a word that sounds like we're trying to be like the private sector. And so it just feels like we're making the public sector more like the private sector, and there's some like underlying value in some parts of US politics that is obviously good. And I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about why that's the case. But to answer the question that you first asked, like what would I recommend? For me, there's something really fundamental about wanting and believing in a functional public sector. And that could be very different than an efficient public sector, but it doesn't have to be antithetical. And in a lot of my work, I think about a functioning public sector as being able to deliver the policy goals or the outcomes that we want for our societies. And then all it takes is to go one step back and say, okay, what are the pillars, regardless of the topic, whether it's climate change or a functioning transportation system, for any of those big policy changes that we're trying to move on, you're going to need a functioning public sector, regardless if you're sitting on the left or the right. And for me, that has kind of three components. The first is you're going to need people to be able to deliver the policies and programs. You're going to need to have the skills within government to be able to, negotiate the procurement contracts, as Mariana said, or make decisions about what efficiency goals look like. So there's a big component of how do we make sure we have the people in government who can deliver. The second component of a functioning government, from my perspective, is thinking about the processes and infrastructure. So how do we make sure within government we have the processes and infrastructure to be able to deliver? Those two parts go hand in hand. And then there's this third component, which I think of as kind of a feedback loop. You need to have some form of a feedback loop so that you're learning what works within government. What are the ways in which we're going to measure success? How are we going to test, learn, adapt, and adopt policies that seem to be working? And how would we know that that's the case? And that could be true. I'm an optimist this morning. That could be true regardless of whether or not you're on the left or the right. Regardless of what your fundamental goal is, having a functioning public sector seems to be at its base. And I couldn't agree more with Mariana and her work that the best way to dismantle government is to take out all that capacity from government itself and to make sure that it lives outside of the fundamentals of the administrative state.
Thank you so much. Great. And Yamini, please, I would love to hear your contribution as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's a real honor and privilege to be part of this very, very important conversation. I agree very much with all that has been said. And perhaps what I'll do in my remarks is to add one more dimension that we might want to consider given the contemporary moment that is not specific to one country, but across democracies, a broad disenchantment with democracy and the state, which is where I think the use of the word efficiency in the contemporary moment is actually marks a rupture from how it has been used in the past, in that increasingly efficiency is being adopted to pursue a undemocratic, centralized imagination of the state, in the ruse that centralization of power enables quote unquote, getting things done efficiently. Let me make my point with a small vignette from India, where I have done most of my work on the ground, engaging with the state. Many years ago, I cut my teeth in a process that civil society organizations and social movements in India had developed called a social audit. It was an effort to empower the ordinary citizen with one of the most fundamentally core tools of what the state should do, auditing government programs. And the purpose of that empowerment of citizens with information of government and creating processes that enable them to audit the state was designed with the goal of pursuing the value of democracy, empowering citizens to be active claim makers of the state, particularly in public works programs where corruption was rife. So citizens would go through a process of training on government processes, rules, etc. Go house to house auditing whether participants in public works programs had actually received funds that governments were supposed to have provided them, payment for work on government programs, and then through a process of public hearings, tactically in person hold government to account for monies that have been siphoned off from individual wages of the poorest citizen. Now, this was a tedious process. It would require, as in organizations that were part of this process, it would require us to go through 2-3 weeks of training ourselves, weeks of organizing of government materials. I remember one night we sat up 3 nights in a row, in fact, till 3 a.m, putting all the government documents, and there were reams and reams of those. The inefficient government is very much in the popular imagination, the red tape government. It is true, there is a lot of paper. Putting all of that succinctly in forms and ways that the ordinary citizen could understand. And we asked ourselves, should it really take this much time to get small amounts of money across the country? We're asking the same question. Over time, we've more or less given up on this process of social auditing, leaving it instead to a process of cash transfers in the name of efficiency using technology to deliver money. But in that process, what we lost was this very fundamental democratic moment of empowering citizens to act as claim makers, demanding from the state and ensuring that the state delivers in ways that are genuinely responsive to needs on the ground. Efficient states may well potentially deliver if your goal of delivery is ensuring that money transfers from A to B, but in that process, it can serve as a ruse to undermine the complex, messy, but very, very crucial process of democratic bargaining. Ultimately, the state in a democratic context engages with citizens, not as clients. It's not a transactional process. We don't go to the state to buy a sandwich. We engage with the state largely in affective terms. And therefore, we demand much more from the state than just the act of a good quality sandwich for which we purchase based on market value. We expect the state to, in conversation with citizens, negotiate democratic bargains. And in the process of those democratic bargains, there may well be trade-offs that are made. Environmental goals may override quote unquote efficient market goals for certain kinds of things. Certain types of regulation may create many hurdles in getting things done, but those regulations will be essential to ensure that we have a stable, just, and sustainable society. So my plea is for us to recognize that in this moment, efficiency has become a ruse under which it is legitimizing a deep centralization of power that is fundamentally undemocratic and takes therefore away the purpose of the state and moves the citizen far further away from the state than it already is. And we should be working towards a much more engaged, a much more embedded state that is responsive to citizens. That is its purpose, and that is what will make it more effective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last, oh, thank you. Thank you. And last but not least, Damon.
So good morning, everyone. And I'm Damon Silvers, as was said. I'm a visiting professor here, and I worked for the American Trade Union movement for a long time. And I was slightly involved in the establishment of the CFPB that Rohit led. I want to talk about three things. The first is power. The second is circularity. And the third, which I am totally plagiarizing from Mariana, is value. And I hope you'll see that these things connect. I'm struck by two words that have come up today. One of them is Taylorism. Josh began by talking about Taylorism. Taylorism was the process, a man named Frederick Taylor designed it. Taylorism was the process of systematically stripping knowledge and power from line workers in industrial firms in the early 20th century. Knowledge and power in industrial processes had belonged to expert workers and was transferred to engineers who, in the United States at least, were put in the managerial class. This is a warning. The warning is that things that sound technical are actually about power. Secondly, the term chainsaw, the title of this panel, reminds me of a guy I once knew, Chainsaw Al Dunlap. I don't know if you remember, if that means anything to anybody, but he was the CEO of a major manufacturing company, Scott Paper, in the United States, in the mid-90s, when the internet was sort of where AI is today. And he told this story about himself that he was the master of efficiency, that through using a chainsaw in his firm, he would produce vast amounts of value. What he actually produced was securities fraud, and he went to prison. But he did fire a lot of people at Scott Paper. A lot of those people and their children and grandchildren seemed to be demographically the people who elected Donald Trump in Pennsylvania twice, which again tells you that there are consequences to these things. Now, secondly, I want to talk about circularity. The idea of efficiency in government runs the risk of circularity. Let me explain why. Because how do you measure it? Efficiency means doing something, and the something is the value point, doing something on a cost-efficient basis, meaning doing it with the fewest possible resources in the most effective way. How do you measure these things? There's something called cost-benefit analysis that was the favorite of sort of left neoliberals, particularly in the 1990s. Think about the question. How are you measuring these things? How are you measuring costs and benefits when you're making public decisions? What prices are you using? Well, guess what? You're using the prices that the markets you are trying to shape, or even more modestly correct, are giving you. It's circular. And it cuts out the very process of democracy that public administration is supposed to be about. The question of what is value, what purpose are you pursuing efficiently, is the point of democracy. And if you just read market prices back into it, you're simply conceding the world in which private power wishes to make. Now, that's not to say that cost management's not a good idea. But you can't allow that to become your source of value. And so finally, we come to value. How do we determine value? In the process of democracy is both a way of determining value, and as Yamini said, it is a value itself. Which brings us back to Scott Paper and the disillusion with democracy that was produced by the process, the way that deindustrialization and radical inequality proceeded in industrialized countries. There was something of value that was destroyed there, which produced and is producing today horrible consequences. Now, what this should tell us, though, and this comes, I'm going to conclude with this point. Things like, see, Maria's bell has gone off. Things like fighting climate change, getting climate change under control, are almost impossible to price in the way that quote, efficiency experts would price them. You can understand efficiency, and I'm now going to plagiarize from Mariana in my overtime, is that you can understand efficiency in relation to something like getting climate change under control as getting the job done quickly at all costs. And on that point, I'll close.
Thank you for a fantastic first round of responses. The second part, as I mentioned before, is the what do we do? What's the prescription? What comes next? But listening to the panel, I'm struck by the point on efficiency as a value. And given the nature of our political landscape, this is inherently going to be divided, and often divided not just on ideological grounds, but more specifically, obviously, on partisan grounds. And in service of kind of advancing this question, I want to maybe split it into two. If the original conceit is what would be your prescription, I'm curious what you would give to people who are efficiency maximalists, the people that are trying to, potentially with good faith, really try to advance this. What would you like to see them specifically do differently, or what would you like to earnestly ask them? Maybe let's change course a little bit. That inherently follows from your previous statement. But I'm also curious what you would also tell to the people that are more interested in putting other values more centered. What would you like them to push or understand or do about efficiency if they were going to center, for instance, equality is a better value, or effectiveness is a better value, or the advancement of the qualitative changes in society that we want to see through initiatives such as mission-oriented innovation. So with that in mind, I would love to.
Josh, maybe I can just start with this, which
Please.
is, I actually think it's also important, and we heard from Damon and others about this. We have to be extremely careful about making things seem like physics or chemistry. There really is not something that you can exactly measure in these exercises, and it's why the democratic process is so important. I'll give just two quick examples, which is in the 1990s, President Clinton and Vice President Gore went through a process called reinventing government. And there were two agencies that were very central to, they turned them into more like private sector organizations. One was an organization called the Patent and Trademark Office, and another was our Office of Federal Student Aid, which gives out student loans. And in both situations, they began to evaluate the staff and the management based on how fast they could approve patents. And in the case of federal student aid, how fast they could disperse student loans. And in both situations, you saw a dramatic reduction in the assessments on quality of those patents, which many of us believe played a major role in the spiraling costs of drug prices in the United States, because there was basically a rise of fake patents to block out new drugs from entering. In the case of that Office of Federal Student Aid, yeah, it was efficient to get more out. A massive student loan crisis was created because there was no oversight over the schools that were participating in that. So that really speaks to it, that even though those measurement issues also ended up having a dollars and cents issue for our public. So it is sort of the McKinseyization of governance. And I worked there. You see how consulting firms want to do what is easily measurable because they look at this as a technocratic craft, when in reality, people dying because they can't afford prescription drugs is not a technocratic matter. So in terms of a prescription in a totally new way, I actually really think we have, and I consider myself in some ways an efficiency maximalist in public governance. Certainly, you know, it was not, people didn't like when I eliminated executive positions, eliminated a lot of functions. You do need constant reinvention. But I wanna just point, and Marianne, I'd love for you to speak to this too. We're seeing some new ways to reimagine deals. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but we recently in the US have, there was an approval of a big steel merger, and the government is getting a golden share to exercise new rights. And I see how there is being created a new way to exercise power and value that is not using taxpayer-paid resources. And I actually think it is worth us also, while I totally disagree with this steel merger, I think there is something useful about rethinking regulation, rethinking public investment, reimagining licensing and intellectual property, rethinking how the public participates in deal making. And I think that we have a lot of work to do rather than just thinking about funding and employees.
Great, thank you. And because you got a direct call out there, I'd love to.
And we should make sure again that we keep, because also it's 5 in the morning for them. So let's make sure that we just keep, you know, make sure everyone gets their points in. So, I mean, I'm taking here, I'm also going to time myself again. Taking your question seriously, that second question, which is, you know, we can all say what the problem is and what do we do? And I kind of wrote down some solutions of which you both actually touched on in terms of the seeds of those. The first, which we've all said, but it's good just to write it down. This is not about outputs, it's about outcomes, right? I mean, that is the whole point of our kind of missions approach. But then the next question is, who sets that outcome, right? Where's the democratic participation that we're sure that what we're even going for, what the state is saying is good for the public in terms of outcomes, not outputs. You know, that's I'll just say second. Make sure you actually, when relevant, it might be less relevant, again, going to the moon, it's incredibly relevant how we set our climate strategies. These are social. Your point about this isn't physics, it's not Newtonian physics. That's why lots of us who did alternative economic thinking also use alternative mathematics. You know, it's not that there's too much math in economics, it's the wrong math. It literally comes from Newtonian physics, not from biology and so on. So when you start thinking about outcomes, not outputs, how do you then actually measure dynamically efficiency?
Yeah.
And literally talking about cost benefit, they would have never even bothered going to the moon if they did a cost benefit analysis. Again, forget whether it was the right thing to do or not, just for a second. It would have just been like, the cost, you know, of failure is going to be too high. What they did do, but they didn't actually then formalize, hence this is a solution potentially in terms of what goes into measurement criteria. In this country, it's called the Green Book. How do you actually evaluate public investments is make sure that you actually aren't just, again, tinkering and getting the wrong costs and the wrong prices. That's the next point about what is the right kind of value and cost and price to set along the way. But literally think of the moon landing. What happened along the way was all these solutions that they had to solve that got us camera phones, folio blankets, baby formula, baby diapers, so on and so forth. Even if they had blown up just before getting there, you could actually, from public point of view, from you know, how we're measuring this more dynamically, not statically, say that it was successful because you're generating economy-wide spillovers along the way. So this concept of dynamic spillovers is something very concrete that we have actually tried to influence with this government that is setting itself these missions, which regardless of whether we think they're the right missions or not, is like, we'll make sure that you actually are translating this outcomes-oriented approach in how you actually evaluate public investments. And also in terms of additionality, like the point of government is not to increase profits, right? It's actually to get investment to happen in an outcomes-oriented way and all those things that matter to people and planet. And additionality in most government programs, definitely tax incentives, even R&D tax incentives, which sound kind of good. Oh yeah, we'll get more R&D. Most of the proof is that it's just increased profits. So it's lowered costs. It hasn't actually generated new investment that would have happened, that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So also that measure of additionality, again, for what? Right? So it always goes back to the democratic point, which is for war, for building a wall on the Mexican border, or is it for, again, the problems that we actually care about? And as we heard from the Indian situation at that local level, how important it is to actually have democratic participation to even set those goals. Third, which was also brought up, in order to attract people, like we can say people matter, but if it's like so demoralizing to work in government, I actually began the entrepreneurial state with David Cameron's quote where he said, civil servants are the enemies of enterprise. But we've heard the same thing, unfortunately, recently from the Labor government. And it's just, I mean, you know, people can say it nicer, more politely, but with that dogma, with the dogma, oh, SpaceX is the cool thing and NASA's this big bureaucracy, notwithstanding all the history where we know where all the innovation came from, a lot of people leave. There's literally a hemorrhaging of talent from NASA, not only because they're being bought up, a lot of the talent from these excess, we talked about this other day, excess rents that have been accrued going to the large tech companies that then have the money to actually, you know, pay crazy salaries that universities and public labs don't, but also because people get depressed. It's like, see you later, baby. If I'm going to be constantly, you know, accused of being part of the problem. And lastly, this whole issue of price and value. I mean, you know, I wrote a whole book about it, so I won't talk about it, but, you know, I'll just say an anecdote. Imagine this, after the financial crisis, after Goldman Sachs gets bailed out over, what was it? 10 million. No, yeah, but how much?
Oh,
10 million?
well, it's a
Billion.
Yeah.
Well, it's
Anyway, the leader of Goldman Sachs says Goldman Sachs workers are the most productive, and he was right. Because how we measure productivity literally confuses price with value. So just because you're getting paid a shitload of money, you're considered productive if we confuse price with value. It's more complicated than that, but why is it that we don't hear, you know, school teachers say, I'm the most productive, you know, nurses say, it's partly, unfortunately, gets into the mind, right? People don't even brag about all these great things they've generated because we also don't know how to measure it. Well, I'll finish on that. When you don't know how to measure something, the huge value that school teachers provide, huge value that the nurses provide, unfortunately, not only is it wrong for all the reasons we know, the value of public investment, but unfortunately, it also gives huge arrogance to certain members who actually have just parasitically, benefited, whether it's from the bailouts or from huge amounts of public investment. And that really damages what happens inside organizations. In terms of the depression that kind of sets in, and I could say more about that, but
no, thank you. Oh. And to continue the tradition of going on the previous call out, Yamini, love to hear your contribution.
Thank you. Look, I come from a country that managed where the state has been able to get us to the moon with great efficiency, but is simply unable to do all the basic things that most people in this audience would take for granted, like fix your potholes, run public schools with teachers that actually show up, have a health system where when you go to the doctor, there's more than a 50-50 chance that you will get properly diagnosed for something as simple as diarrhea. On every basic fundamental measure of public services, the Indian state is frankly a big fail. And part of that failure is on account of its inefficiency. But what has really struck the debate in India, and I think it has resonances in many other parts of the world, is that this lived experience of state failure on an everyday basis and the search for efficiency has kind of coalesced into a social consensus of some sorts, where everyone seeks to bypass the state. It's sort of, can technology be used as a way to cut through the layers of all the administrative structures to bypass and deliver cash directly to citizens? Can outsourcing outsourcing crucial functions of the state through public-private partnerships, etc., be a means to bypass the state and ensure that everybody gets basic services. And in that process, we have not only, as Mariana was pointing out, fundamentally hollowed out the state and its capacity, we've also created a culture within the state where the search for solutions is framed within this kind of new public management framework of seeking efficiency in a way that hollows out capacities of the state and reinforces the very notion of the state as a hierarchical, distant actor that needs broadly to regulate, but is simply incapable of delivering. I find it quite fascinating that in most of the conversations I have with the Indian bureaucracy, senior policymakers, and we have a very, very difficult process of entering into the senior policy making structure of the Indian administrative state. It's lakhs of Indians, millions of Indian students spend the better part of 6 years of their life after an undergraduate degree desperately trying to enter into this system, and less than 0.1% actually make it. So these are remarkably smart people, but they have absolutely no faith in the capability of the state to deliver. So I would say one of the first and most important things that we need to do is, as broadly re-enchant society and actors of the state with the belief that the state can actually deliver. And that process of delivery requires embedding purpose and capacity within the state, not seeking to consistently bypass and move out of the state. There is a second layer to this that I think is equally important. In seeking to make the state more efficient and adopting new public management kind of principles, we have in the Indian context, for instance, very much taken on the grammar of not outputs, but outcomes. We need to think about what we want the state to deliver. We are looking for effectiveness, and measurement and performance management has to be designed from the perspective of outcomes. But unfortunately, as Mariana rightly said, what those outcomes are matter, and sometimes the process itself becomes the goal. So we have created more than 500 management information systems, all with all kinds of measurements of data on what the state is supposed to do or is doing, real-time information systems, biometrics to check attendance, IVRS systems to see whether things are actually happening on the ground in far-flung places. But we forgot that you have to actually build capacities within the state to be able to empower frontline workers to learn from data and deploy that data with degrees of discretion for implementation. I've had countless encounters with frontline workers of the Indian state where they speak of hierarchy and administrative process as things that have undermined their own capability to do anything. They think of themselves as nothing, they say, but post officers. I wrote a paper called The Post Office Paradox. This is not a post office that is efficient, where it's moving paper or letters from place A to place B and delivering it to far-flung sites in a country. This is a post office literally as moving paper from one pigeonhole to the next, with absolutely no power to take decisions. And so when you ask them if there is something that you can do to improve the quality of education in your district, what would you do? They shrug their shoulders and say, well, the state has power, it can do lots of things, but I don't have any. And as a citizen, I'm scratching my head going, but aren't you the state? So how do we, at the heart of this is the challenge of empowering and building capacity, deliberative capacity within the state to learn from processes of measurement, to break hierarchies and ensure that actors within the state are infused with a sense of purpose and mission orientation. So that mission orientation is not just a social contract that is determined between citizen and state, that's at the heart of it, but that same process of building a social contract has to be rebuilt internally inside the state so that that sense of purpose is infused and every frontline actor feels like the forest rangers that Herbert Kaufman studied back in the day, where the purpose of being a forest ranger is so infused that you don't need technology to survey you. You don't need to perfect the panopticon of the state to make sure that actors are everywhere getting things done, quote unquote, efficiently, but people are infused with a sense of purpose and just go out and do their jobs. Many state actors are those people, but processes inside the state have taken that away, and the urge to bypass has hollowed out the possibilities of building the sense sense of purpose inside the state. I think that will take us much more forward than any debate on efficiency and chainsaws that cut out the flack. Sure, there is a lot, but without purpose, you will just be chains hacking off people and leaving out an even more hollowed state.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. And Professor Linehouse.
You know, I'm listening to this conversation and I'm feeling really optimistic because I've been in so many conversations where the narrative is, you know, Trump won twice, or we're seeing this kind of explosion of right-wing philosophies across the globe because the progressives don't have a united vision for what good looks like. And so what I'm hearing today is actually on a global scale, we're making a similar point, which I think is a good thing. So at risk of being redundant, I just want to say yes and to everything we've already heard from the other speakers, and I think that's a good thing. So when I founded the People Lab, which focuses on the people of government and the communities that they're called to serve, I did so because I had worked for the Greek government during the Greek financial crisis. And it became very clear to me, something that Yamini just said, that we had the best and the brightest of the world, from Brussels to the IMF to every economist we could call on, to come help on policy design, like how we were going to reform government. We had to reform government overnight to make it less bloated, even though we had no measurement of bloat, but that's a whole separate conversation. And nobody was paying attention to the people of government. Nobody was talking to the career public servants who were being asked to change all of their processes and all of their ways of working while their pensions were being cut and while the global community was calling them lazy and corrupt. And it became very clear that that kind of systematic disdain for the public servant might be at the center of why we can't really understand like how to get rid of what we call red tape or bureaucracy or government. So to me, I just want to echo what I've heard from others, that really thinking through what it means to recruit, retain, and support the people who work in government to deliver all these great innovations has to be at the center of any kind of progressive investment in the public sector. My sense is, and this is going to be a hard sell, I think, politically, that there is no way to get around a deeper and more systematic investment in the government itself. No workarounds, no kind of shifting to more private-public partnerships, but fundamentally investing in the public sector. And when we think about the for what question and what kind of outcomes matter, I think it's okay if different governments or different levels of government have different priorities. I think that's part of the democratic process. One thing that I think about from a behavioral science perspective is how do we get there? So what does it mean to start with the experience of interacting with your government, right? What does it mean to start with a feeling that I trust my government, not only to be competent, but also to be benevolent and honest, the 3 dimensions of trust. So I trust that they can fix the pothole in a cost-efficient way. I also trust that they have my best interest at heart, so that they're delivering programs in a way that helps me live my life. And I trust that they are going to do what they say they're going to do. It's really fundamental if you think about kind of basic dimensions of trust. Now, if we put together those 2 pieces, if we say we're going to start with the people of government, and by that I really do mean career civil servants and even more closely frontline workers, and the experience of residents when they have to interact with their government, or even when they don't have to interact with their government. We want to be able, going back to the early parts of the conversation, we want to not have to think about whether or not when we open our faucet, the water is clean. That's because there's a frontline worker on the other side of that, making sure that's the case. But if we put those 2 pieces together and we say we're going to invest all our efforts and time and efficient dollars and euros and pounds on making sure their experiences are good, the frontline worker and the resident on the other end, I think that's going to bring us to a point where we can have these kind of bigger conversations. Let me say one more thing, which I think many of you might have heard. I don't even know if it's a true story, but it's a great story, so I'll share it. There's a story about NASA about putting people on the moon, and JFK going to visit the people who were working on this and passing by a janitor and saying, "Oh, what do you do here at NASA?" And he said, I'm trying to put a man on the moon. And I think we've really fundamentally lost that sense of cohesive purpose for government. I think it's a beautiful thing when it can happen, but potentially one area where the progressive movement does need to take ownership is that we haven't had that clarity of purpose for each of our agencies. We haven't been able to kind of confidently say this is what we're all working towards in a systematic way that everyone can get behind. Now that's going to look very different in different countries, but my sense is that, part of shifting the narrative about what it means to invest in the public sector also is about being really crisp and clear about what we're trying to get to. I'll stop there.
Thank you. And again, last but not least, and a very good person for a summit position, Damon.
All right, great. So I've been listening to this conversation and thinking about what's involved here in what I might say to an efficiency expert, right, an efficiency maven. And I think this conversation has brought out sort of, again, a couple of key points. The first thing I think that this moment, and I alluded to this in my opening remarks when I'm talking about Al Dunlap in 1995. We are in a moment when there's a very great risk of the illusion of technological magic. Right? It's probably true, based on everything that I've read and everyone I've talked to at least, it's probably true that AI is going to produce a very significant changes in how work is done, and productivity, and a variety of things. Probably true. Right? It may be beyond our experience even, the degree in which it makes change. But today, the experience of business that has tried to put AI to work has been fairly negative. And so therefore, when somebody says, I'm going to rip apart government because AI can do it better, they're almost certainly scamming you, because they almost certainly don't know how to do that. Right? What they are doing is saying, here's AI, but actually what I'm going to do is something much more primitive. Right? I alluded in the last thing to basically like going in, like a vandal going into an abandoned house and ripping out the pipes. Right? That's not very high tech. But that's essentially what DOGE was doing. And the numbers have now proved it out. There's a second, but so paying attention to what the actual capabilities of technologies are and how far along in the development of those technologies we're in. Anyone genuinely concerned about government efficiency should really keep a skeptical eye on that one. Now, secondly, is the question of what actually is going on in relation to governments that bring forward efficiency as their objective. I think a lot of us, because of the way things have gone on in the last 40 years, a lot of us think that when we see governments of the right talking about efficiency, that what they are trying to do is diminish government. But that is not what authoritarians do. And we need to be real clear about that. Again, watch out. Without using words loosely, let's just talk about actual fascism, Italian fascism. The Italian fascist state was not in the business of dismantling the state. It was in the business of strengthening, right? But only strengthening a certain aspect of it. Right? Authoritarians seek to discredit the state as an instrument of social solidarity, to create the political and psychological context to construct a predatory state, a strong predatory state, a state with lots of armed men, a state with lots of surveillance capacity, a state with the ability to extract value from its citizenry and from the larger world. So watch out when people start talking about, we're going to diminish the state and so forth, because they may not, in fact, intend to do that at all. What they may intend to do is to make that state less demanding of the wealthy and powerful. Right? They may intend to dismantle the redistributive aspects of the state. That's what DOGE was about. DOGE was about giving cover to gigantic tax breaks that destroyed, that sought to undermine the solidaristic aspects of the American state, and in particular to discredit Social Security, which has now been, by the way, highly documented, and I think frankly has failed. Now, the final point I want to make is about something that in political philosophy is called civic virtue, because that's what we've been talking about here. We've been talking about the fact that successful states are motivated by civic virtue. They're not motivated by algorithms. They're not motivated by financial incentives. They're not motivated by the kind of thing that Rohit was describing earlier when he talked about these kind of like push out the loans or whatever. They're motivated by people who understand what they're doing to be profoundly in the interests of their society and their fellow citizens, and who are prepared to sacrifice their time, their earnings power, in some cases their lives, if you think about wartime, for the common good. When states are infused with that, and by the way, this is using 18th century political philosophy to talk about what Mariana talks about when she talks about missions. Right? When people are on a mission, then the state works. When we're trying to have them, be turned into robots under algorithms, or when we're trying to have them turn them into investment bankers, then the state fails. And the final thing I'm going to say, because I've become the ancient mariner in relation to this, is that Elizabeth's 3 criteria of trust, my heart kind of broke listening to it, because those were the 3 things that the governments of the advanced democracies, and particularly the United States, and to a lesser degree the United Kingdom, but also Ireland and Germany. This is exactly what did not happen in the financial crisis.
Yeah.
Right? It did not happen. Right? When Mariana was talking about the Goldman Sachs bailout, right? If you ask the CEO of Goldman Sachs today, he would say, "Oh no, we weren't bailed out. Right? We weren't Citigroup. We weren't AIG. We weren't bailed out." No, but you were the counterparty to AIG and to Citigroup. The bailout was all about you. And in fact, in deep detail, Goldman Sachs was bailed out. And so, by the way, it was JP Morgan Chase. But there were lies told, lies about who the money went to and why, right? And I'll tell you right now, I talked to the liars and they admitted it to me that they were lying about critical aspects of this. Secondly, the public wasn't benefited. Huge wealth transfers moved from the public to the banks. And third, it didn't achieve the thing it was set out to achieve. We got a decade, 2 decades in this country of economic stagnation as a result of how they did it, right? Now, this is the rot that underlies how we got to right-wing authoritarianism. And we have to do it differently in the future. We have to. And so on that note, I ask your pardon because I have this obsession, having witnessed it, having warned that it would lead to authoritarianism, and having watched it do so. It's hard not when given a microphone and given Elizabeth's prompt to not just hammer those 3 things she said and how they were not done and what the horrible cost was.
Thank you. And thank you to all the speakers for fantastic comments. Given time, I think we might move on to Q&A.
Yeah,
and open it up so we can dive a little bit deeper into the comments that we've all been able to make. And with that in mind, I also want to say thank you to everyone who came on a Friday morning, on a very warm day and a very warm week. And as well, again, thank you to our fantastic speakers who are waking up very early. So with that in mind and potentially copping out, I would love to give some discretion to the assistants who are handing out the microphones to choose some questions.
Hi, good morning.
Also, I'm so sorry. Before we begin, I just want to say, and to borrow from my colleague Nai, please end your question with a question. By virtue of time, we don't have enough to accommodate statements or comments. So what we want is a number of questions so that we can dive deep. However, if you have any statements or comments, we'll be in the refreshments afterwards to expand on that. So thank you.
Sure. I should introduce myself, of course,
Please.
also. My name is Garrett Kelly. I'm the coordinator for Net Zero Sarajevo in Bosnia, and it's a mission city. Well, we hope to get the mission label. I have a question for you. I think the missions are things that are able to subvert the inefficiency. this is my theory, and I'm putting it to you to ask you this question, that part of the civil service job is to be in equilibrium, to resist change. And so when you bring in a system like a mission approach, only the people who are virtuous civil servants want to work on that, because it goes outside the normal rules. Nothing is agreed, right? So for the job's worth, they stay in the system and they do things by the rules. You introduce a mission approach to a city, you get the people in the private sector, in the civil service, who would otherwise leave, and they start joining a mission approach because it's outside the rules and you're making up new rules. And I think that COP was started out like something like this, outside the system, and it's been hijacked. And I'm hoping that mission cities are not going to be. So I'm thinking that mission cities are a good way to improve efficiency by taking the virtuous civil servant and private sector person and operating outside the rules, by the way, with a very concrete aim, with a data aim of, you know, getting there. You measure it, you've either done it or you haven't, to quote the professor. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll take 3 questions and then we'll get responses.
Thank you. I would just like to ask a question about timescales. So I appreciate most of what everyone has said, but I'm thinking in the very short term here in the UK, we have DOGE teams in local authorities working now. So what do we do in a short time scale to resist? Because a lot of what you've all said seems extremely reasonable, but is not going to happen quickly necessarily. So what can we do now while we have teams in local authorities in this country probably trying to decimate extremely under-resourced public services?
Thank you. And one more.
Hi, my name is Camila, and I am an MPA candidate at IIPP. My question is related to how do we get people to change the value of efficiency? Because as Project 25 said in the bureaucracy chapter, the cutting cost and efficiency was just to provide a simple story to the average citizen, but the real objective is amassing unchecked power in the executive. So I want to understand, if we want to change the narrative of the efficiency, we need to change the views people have or what they're demanding from their politicians. And I'm wondering how we can do that.
Great, thank you. So 3 questions. Damien, you just mentioned that you had a comment you wanted to make.
Well, just on the question about DOGE and local authorities, right? The one that I'm familiar with is the Durham County Council. I believe there are a couple others. Right? They're not dominant in UK local authority, but there are a couple. And the first thing that needs to be said about this is what the Trade Union Council Congress says, which is if you work for one of these authorities, you need to join a union. Really, really important kind of basic thing about both self-protection, institutional protection, and protection of the public interest. The second thing is that in the United Kingdom, I think those of you who live here know this, that despite all the sort of Magna Carta stuff, the United Kingdom is an extraordinarily centralized state. And local authorities are funded by, in many cases, administer national programs. They are not it's not a federal state. It's not a state where local government has the kind of autonomy that it does in the United States, say, or perhaps in India. I would defer to Yamini on that point. And what that means is that the public in those communities needs to insist that the national government oversee the implementation of national government programs by those local authorities and not allow vandalism of public institutions and public assets and the failure to deliver on the programs those councils are responsible for. And thirdly, local political organization is the third thing that needs to happen, right? And political, I don't mean political in that, I think it will certainly be local party political organization. That's going to happen whatever we say on this panel. But a deeper kind of organization, one that engages civil society intensely on the question of what do we expect from local government and what kind, both substantively in terms of services, but also in terms of accountability, transparency, and engaging in the democratic process is the third thing.
Great. Marianne.
I thought it was super interesting how the three questions actually one
Yeah.
leads to another. So for example, if we begin with, can missions, if they're taken seriously and done right and not confuse, again, economic kind of outcomes with the mission itself, can they actually then spur the kind of change and investment towards that change? Well, that's, if that's not happening, then we should hold government to account to not use the word missions, right? I mean, if you're just using it to say, a goal and then saying the goal is productivity or growth, or even confusing, again, outcomes with output. So number of vaccines instead of enabling your whole population to be protected during the pandemic. That's the first thing. So making sure that the missions are actually set up in such a way that require the change. That kind of comes to the second one on timescales. As you say, if things are starting to go wrong here or in other countries, how do we use the concept of missions to hold government to account immediately on whether things are being done right? The first thing, are you even working across government, right? Missions are all about having kind of the interdepartmental. If the missions start to get siloed in one a part of government, you could say, nope, hold on, let's quickly move that. Are we not investing in the capacity of the civil service to deal with these really complex problems? There's a group up in Manchester that showed, for example, obesity has about 300 different causes. So if using the concept of missions is making us think in a simplistic way and kind of simple answers, as opposed to, for example, training the civil service to even know how to deal with complexity itself as a methodology, it's not going to work. And third, the question from Camilla, Project 25, you said, ultimately it was about power. Your examples that you gave of the US Patent Office, where the use of the word efficiency just basically led to cuts, which then benefited the companies, that was actually sort of done on purpose. It wasn't actually about efficiency. There's power, but there's also money. There's billions, if not trillions, being made globally by weakening state capacity and by not actually having a mission that's for people, but ultimately, for, let's say, capital, if we want to put it that way. But you could actually go one by one, the FDA, the Patent Office, the BBC here, what's happening here. These aren't, oh, whoops, by chance we weaken government along the way. That was the whole point. It's not surprising that, I actually remembered his name, it was Mitt Romney. Romney and Trump, back in the days of Trump 1, they actually went after state capacity in terms of the organizational competence. They went after PBS, they went after ARPA-E, because they're smart, money comes and goes. But if you take away the remit of the state around energy, around health, around good public broadcasting, that's the best way to kill government, because it'll take potentially, in terms of time, half a century to build it back, whereas money comes and goes. But the three kind of lead one to another. You have to immediately, not in a year, not in 2 years, hold government to account when they're using that concept of missions. And if they're not working in a mission-oriented way today, and yet using the concept of missions, you immediately, have reasons to then go in and say, well, then why are you cutting why are you doing DOGE in a stupid way if you're actually thinking about these complex problems?
Yeah, let me add on this, which is try and answer all of them. One thing that I think is being discussed in the US in corporate America is actually a huge fear of a DOGE that goes in the other direction. A DOGE that stops approving patents, that stops approving banking applications, that stops approving mining licenses, that stops allowing companies to enforce their contracts through administrative processes. And it's quite telling that actually corporate interests heavily rely on the state in so many ways. In the US, almost every single state has, in their state courts, we have a state court system. The number one type of filing in those state courts is creditors suing borrowers to collect. So I think there are some who are wondering, how could this come in another direction? And it may be useful for those business interests to know that here. It's also useful for people to speak now about what are the results of those cuts, because I think sometimes when we have been able to communicate, killing off agencies like mine that I once led, it's not very popular. And I think that is very culturally specific, but it needs to be said. I want to just, and I hope Elizabeth, you can weigh in on this. I think it is good to honor the civil service. We probably also need to think about what is the next iteration of the civil service in advanced governments. It is probably, in my view, a need to provide insulation from too much political interference. But I also think it is worth thinking, how do we cross-fertilize and build people's skills better? How do we make sure that people are sometimes switching up roles, agencies, but also how are we bringing in people with amazing skills from the private sector to come in to serve the public, not just to serve their private interests when they go back? And it may be worth us doing some real thinking on what that new civil service should look like after we go through this moment.
Should I jump in on that point?
Please.
So couldn't agree more. The only tweak I would say, I don't think we can wait until after. I think one of the things that anyone who cares about government needs to be thinking about is, what are we doing now to build the narrative so that when it's time to rebuild, and that it's going to look different in different countries, we're ready with an answer to the question, what is this going to look like now? So you're absolutely right. We can't go back to there's no way that we're going to go back to kind of a previous consensus about what government should look like, what the public sector should look like, what hiring and firing should look like in the public sector. And so I think that the moment is now to really think through what that looks like. And every time we kind of come up with a solution, really question kind of what is our underlying assumption about who currently works in government and what their skills and capacities are, and really kind of think through when we're kind of allowing a narrative that like everyone who works in government like isn't good enough to kind of feed into our solutions. That being said, I couldn't agree more. This is exactly the time to think not only about how do we recruit new talent, new and diverse talent into government, how do we make sure that people don't lose morale in their first 2 years of service, and how do we build the space for people who I think are actually quite naturally very innovative because they've had to work with fewer resources for generations, to use that innovation for good. The only thing I'd add to the questions that we heard, I agree with everything that previous speakers have said, is that it really has started to look like calling out DOGE policies and actively having a movement that says this is not what we want seems to be working a little bit in the US. So we've had historic protests in the past few weeks. There's a way in which asking more of your government is allowing for some of those DOGE cuts to be reinstated. And so, as we think about how do we rebuild for the next 4 years, for the next generation, for the next 20 years, let's not lose hope for what we can do today. The one example I'll give you is in the social safety net world, there's two competing success metrics. One is the narrative that comes with DOGE that says there's vast fraud in the social safety net, people who are not eligible are using the programs. In reality, we have no evidence of that. People perceive it at like 35%. In reality, it's less than 1% for most programs. But you can imagine a competing narrative that says, I don't want you, government, to measure success based on how many fraudulent people you keep out, but how many eligible people are able to access anti-poverty programs. And if you just switch the success metric, still in a mode of efficiency and productivity and kind of operational capacity, then the policies change dramatically. And so what I kind of think about for my work is how do we make other versions of those success metrics elevated? So we don't kind of build into the narrative that the only thing we care about is fraud or waste or all these words that we've heard since the 80s, but don't actually mean something specific in government in the US.
Can I just very quickly jump in, just sort of pulling all that I've heard together? As an Indian sitting in the United States over these last few months watching DOGE, the one thing that has really struck me repeatedly again and again is how is it that DOGE was able to kind of hack off roughly 10%, 12%, there are different numbers of the federal workforce, and there weren't riots on the streets. I know we're seeing protests now, but from an Indian perspective, a politician is well capable of hollowing out the state and bypassing it in all kinds of ways, but it cannot hack off the state because it's the primary form of employment in India. So the nature of the social contracts are very different, but they come together collectively with this broad societal disenchantment with the state. And so you see protests on the street in the US if the snowblowers don't show up. I know federalism means it's somewhat uneven, but there are certain things that you expect that the basic municipal functions, your garbage will be collected, public schools run more or less, teachers show up. In India, none of that happens, but you can't hack off the government. And I think part of, as I've been trying to reflect on why, part of why we have the societal disenchantment goes back to the hegemony of ideas, the hegemony of new public management and how we debated the state, the hegemony of the possibilities of privatization and as economies were transitioning in the 1980s and 1990s. And so in some senses, we need a new hegemonic set of ideas around the state itself that is a global alliance, or moments like this that talk about the power of the state, the possibilities of the state, and recognize the urgency of reinventing the state to respond to the 21st century moment. This will require both ideas and mobilization on the ground. So more of this at a global scale, more of conversations like we've had today, I think is what's needed inside seminar rooms and on the streets.
That's the whole point. I don't know if you know, but this session is in this 3-day festival called Rethinking the State.
Yes, exactly. Which is why it was so exciting to have this. So I'm saying we need more. Can we take this idea and really do a global kind of...
The mobilization on the ground that you alluded to is so important, and I don't think we focus enough on that. That's what makes it a movement. And the Montpellieran Society did it. They were smart. Yeah.
Great. We're going to go over by just a few minutes to accommodate the fact that we started a little bit late. So with that in mind, I think we can take maybe 2 more questions, and if we could take them from this side of the room. You in the front.
Hi, my name is Arif Azad. I worked in public policy and public health areas in Pakistan and also in the Middle East. Yes, I mean my questions is about rethinking the state. I mean, what is the panel's view about security states where public purpose is absent, and the whole thrust of the security state is to extract maximum taxes and pour that into an... I have the examples of Burma, Egypt, and also Pakistan in mind. I mean, what would rethinking the state in that context would look? And I mean the second question, which is also related, how about the IMF role in eroding the capacity of states in the low end, middle income countries, because the thrust of the structural adjustment program is to get rid of bureaucracy and cut public spending, and that ends up weakening your state capacity to deliver on public services. So I would like view of the panel on these 2 important questions in the terms of rethinking state.
Thank you. I think we can take one more question in the back.
Thank you for the very interesting discussion. I feel like much of the reform and efficiency agenda is focused on fixing institutions that were built for a different century, right? And so we're thinking about rethinking the state. Maybe it's my bias because I come from I work at a growth equity firm, but in a conference about rethinking the state, I would have imagined that I was going to find a bunch of builders, entrepreneurs. And don't get me wrong, the sessions have been fascinating for me. But you know, for me, you can spend all the time you want fixing the Indian financial system, or you can build IMPS and UPI, right? So like, if we were to have a second session of this conference, or third, this is my first time here next year, that was filled with builders, you know, what is it that they really need, right? How do you really, what are the ingredients that are needed so that there's really a wave of institutional innovation, creation? Forget about fixing the old systems, they just built for a different century, right? What are the ingredients of that? What does that look like?
Thank you. Did you want to start?
Sure. So the first thing I want to say is to the first questioner, right? Your point about the security state, and the way you defined it was what I was talking about when I said that the objective of authoritarians is to create a predatory state, right? I think the security state is what they would have you believe that they're doing. What they're actually doing is preying on the society and extracting value. And the rise of this kind of state as a response to essentially the failure of the neoliberal state to get public support and legitimacy at a time when we need an effective solidaristic state to deal with things like climate change. And when the urgency is growing so rapidly is the fundamental challenge of our time. And it goes to what the second questioner was asking about building, right? I do want to recognize here, because truthfully, the man is so modest, that Rohit here is one of the great builders of the American state. And you know, so like, it's not the builders aren't here. They're just modest. And then I want to, because we're closing, I want to tell a very brief little story about how this goes about how we got where we got, right? That has to do with the question of efficiency. In the Obama administration in the United States, one of the things that was promised to mining communities, okay, mining communities in the state, and again, this is a bit of American politics, but when you get the punchline, you'll see why. One of the things that was promised to communities in mining states, in Pennsylvania, in Southern Ohio, West Virginia, to a limited degree in Wisconsin, and Michigan, by the way, and Michigan in the Upper Peninsula. You got to remember, think about what states I'm talking about and what role they then played in American politics. Something that was promised to those communities was a rule to limit the amount of silicon dust that was allowed to be in a mine, or for that matter, in an industrial workplace. Silicon dust will kill you. You would drown in your own lungs, right? In the end, if you're exposed to too much silicon dust. The government comes in, the Obama administration comes in, they put the rule in place. The experts, the occupational safety and health experts motivated by mission psychology, they put that rule in place. And then the rule got sent to the White House, where it was subject to an efficiency test by a Harvard professor named Cass Sunstein, who was in charge of the office at the White House that was in charge of cost-benefit analyses. And he did a calculation, and he decided that that rule was too expensive, that the cost was too great for the benefit. Now, I have not seen his spreadsheet, but I'm damn well sure that he didn't calculate it based on his view of the cost of the benefit, the value of the lives of Harvard professors, right? That he calculated it based on some market value of the lives of coal miners and construction workers, and that he would never have done it if he thought he was condemning his family to drown in their own lungs. Now, so that rule never got enacted. Donald Trump campaigned in those states, won those states, and won the presidency. And what did he do? He repealed that rule because the rule was enacted by Joe Biden. So you understand what the bait and switch is, right? The failure of the neoliberal state, the misuse of cost-benefit analysis, the seizure of power by the predatory state, and essentially the depredation on the very people who were persuaded to vote the predatory state into power.
Thank you so much. I have the great privilege of being on we have about 1 minute to make a closing comment. Yamini, please.
Very quickly jump in on the builder question. I think it's really important to recognize that the question of building needs to align itself very closely with the discourse on power and purpose, that the underlying message of these 3 days. Because if you build without purpose, the building itself can be misused. So UPI, India's financial ID and financial system was just given as an example. It was scaled up in the most undemocratic moment in India when our prime minister demonetized large amounts of cash, that is basically monies that were in the hands of the poor, causing deep distress. So it's very important to align building with power and purpose. The two conversations have to come together, not be held in parallel. Just wanted to say that.
Let me just say on the builder point as well, which is in 2000, Al Gore ran for president, and one of the things that he was made fun of for was he had made a kind of comment that he helped invent the internet. And when there was a lot of reporting on it, and some of the reporting said like maybe he actually did help invent the internet because he was part of a lot of government work to build something that was so paradigm shifting on the flow of information. And I see what is happening for those of you who are European. I'm really worried that Europe is thinking about its own digital future by simply just outsourcing it to big private companies rather than actually creating a tech stack here in Europe. Americans are not afraid of Europeans building more because we need Europe and the UK to build and dream, because that is the only way I think free society will manage through the age of AI. So I hope that it's not just building, but also architects who are thinking of what to build that is in the public interest.
That's the next session.
I'm teeing it up.
Yeah, don't leave. Next session.
Thank you for doing my job for me. With that in mind, thank you very much to the panel. This could go on forever, and I have the great privilege of being around people that I want to listen to immensely and go on. But with that in mind, I need to close the panel, unfortunately, and invite you to get some refreshments. And also, again, please, if you have time, check out the posters in the back done by our fantastic MPA students at IIPP. And thank you very much to the panel, and thank you again immensely to our online speakers for waking up incredibly early for this. So thank you all, and have a great Friday.
Thank you.